And a hearty welcome to one and all. This is episode 175 of the Confessions of a Not-So-Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Friday evening with me as I take this ride home here in New York. And if you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platform such as Spotify or iTunes, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. So today marks 22 years since the release of a movie I absolutely love, Sam Raimi's 2002 iteration of Spider-Man, starring Tobey Maguire and Willem Dafoe, Kirsten Dunst, J.K. Simmons, and a lot of other terrific performers. Now, the movie was pretty well received by critics. It didn't get rapturous praise, but most critics liked it. I thought it was a fucking masterpiece, even if it didn't exactly do what the comic books did, as far as it was a radioactive spider and it was different, and Tobey Maguire was kind of small. Maybe he wasn't big enough, that kind of stuff. And Tobey Maguire's interpretation of Spider-Man, or as Sam Raimi wanted it, he was less of a smart aleck. He was less into giving nicknames to his, adversaries. It was different, but hey, I read the comic book. I thought it worked perfectly. It was really, really good. Of course, the story doesn't start with that movie being released. The reality is that Hollywood had tried to make previous comic book movies with mostly very little success, with the obvious exception of Wesley Snipes in Blade, which kind of came out of nowhere and was a crusher. But they really weren't able to, whoever the they is, if that's, Avi Arad, Kevin Feige, whoever was minding the mint in the late 90s, they weren't able to kind of turn Blade's success into anything, really. So the story of Spider-Man, the cinematic version of Spider-Man, and for those of you who remember that, and they even kind of joked about this in the more recent Spider-Man No Way Home, which I thought was spectacular, one of the main breaks from the comic book and comic book lore with Tobey's Peter Parker is that when he is bitten by the radioactive spider, which in the world of that movie wasn't radioactive. I forgot what it was. It was in the same ballpark, but it was something else. Radioactive. Nobody even knows what that means, right? But in the world of Tobey Maguire Spider-Man, when he is bitten, when he starts to take on characteristics of a spider, he shoots webs out of his wrists. Now, that was not in the comic books. In every version of the comic book, and in the Tom Holland and Andrew Garfield Spider-Man movies, and even the ridiculous Nicholas Hammond TV movie, which was really bad. They say it was made on a shoestring. It was very, very weak. But the backstory on that, as to how there ended up being he didn't have to build a web shooter, it just came out of his wrists. His own blood turning into a spider, whatever. In the mid-1990s, after completing work on True Lies, no less than James Cameron wanted to make a Spider-Man movie. And he wrote it was called a scriptment. It was a cross between a treatment. A treatment would be like a condensed novel. In this case, a fairly heavily condensed novel. In other words, if it's something that's going to be 100 pages, a condensed novel might be 10 or 15. But Cameron didn't just write a treatment, which it's not broken down like a play or a screenplay. It reads like a novel. He wrote a combination between a screenplay and a treatment. He had certain areas in it where he showed and wrote dialogue that he liked, and that's how he did it. James Cameron's Spider-Man script meant what he wanted to turn into a screenplay, what he wanted to turn into a movie, had two villains I believe it had Dr. Octopus and the Sandman. And James Cameron's master plan was to cast Leonardo DiCaprio as Peter Parker / Spider-Man, Arnold Schwarzenegger as Dr. Octopus, which would have been an absolute scream. I mean, it would have been a fucking riot. You know, Doc Ock was German, like that was the connection. Just the idea of Arnold Schwarzenegger getting to make jokes about the size of his arms when it's Arnold Schwarzenegger, 7-time Mr. Olympia, you know, biceps as big as the Matterhorn. Look what I do with my arms, Peter. Gold. Could have been comic gold. James Cameron's scriptment has the organic, as it was called, the organic web shooters. And when he was asked why, it's kind of an obvious question. He said, I never believed that in the comics. So I read the comics, I loved the comics, but it never made any sense to me that an 18-year-old kid, just because he starts to take on characteristics of a spider, he's able to build web shooters. He puts together a contraption that the 3M company and the most brilliant scientists in the world would not have been able to put together. James Cameron called bullshit. That's why he did it. From his perspective, it made more sense. It wasn't like an expediency thing. It made more sense. He's starting to take on characteristics of a spider. Whoever came up with the comic idea in the first place should have thought of this too. Well, needless to say, James Cameron did not make his Spider-Man movie, much to my chagrin. There were rights issues between Paramount and I forgot the other studio, whether it was Universal, but there were rights issues between them and Marvel Comics. And James Cameron was temporarily stuck in limbo, and he became so frustrated because he wanted to make his movie. And he would have probably been able to get his cast together. He waited and waited and waited, and finally he said, thanks but no thanks, I'm out of here, I'm going to do something else. And I'll never forget this. Sitting in the Tisch Common Room, New York University, sometime in April or May of 1995, the news came down, not on the internet, not on social media. Somebody heard on the radio that James Cameron was not making Spider-Man. He was going to do what? He was going to make a movie about the Titanic. Now, when I heard that, my first instinct was, that's a joke, that's not real. When I realized it was real, my next thought was, I don't understand. They've already made a movie about this. The boat sinks. What are we doing here? But I was pissed off because I know that even with the limitations of mid-1990s special effects, looking back on it, James Cameron would have hit a home run. He would have made a great Spider-Man film. But alas, 'twas not to be. And James Cameron did pivot and immersed himself, pun intended, in the world of Titanic, did deep dives, and then he went ahead and shot a very, very arduous and difficult production. And obviously we all know what happened with Titanic, 14 or 15 Oscar nominations, huge acclaim, biggest box office hit ever at the time, over $1 billion, etc., etc. He never looked back, never went to Spider-Man, but the studio still owned his scriptment, and Cameron didn't really give a shit if anybody was going to use the material that he had come up with. He moved on. It's okay, whatever. He didn't really talk about it. He was very proud of Titanic, of course. So when the studio got Sam Raimi, and they start trying to figure out who to cast, are we going to go for, it's not to make a joke, but are we going to go for Freddie Prinze Jr.? Are we going to try to get an older actor and make him look 18? All of these things going through the, the kind of Hollywood press and the rumor mill and trying to figure out what to do. Raimi wanted an actor first. He wasn't necessarily interested in a well-built Abercrombie & Fitch looking guy. So he loved Tobey, and he had seen Tobey Maguire. Tobey had already done some amazing work. He's so good in Pleasantville. He's great in The Ice Storm. He's fantastic in Wonder Boys. Like, he was just knocking him out. Cider House Rules. He's so good. My favorite performance of his is Pleasantville, which I'm sure I'm going to talk about at a certain point on the channel. But Toby was his guy. And for the sort of key roles, the supporting roles, they got Cliff Robertson as Uncle Ben. I don't necessarily think that was, I wouldn't call that inspired casting. It was a good idea. I like what he does in that role. It is kind of limited, but Robertson had been an Oscar winner for Charlie 3 decades earlier. Very talented actor, very distinctive, expressive face and all that. But they kept the organic web shooters. Raimi loved the idea, and there was a lot of talk. There was some controversy, but mostly people were excited about it. That's my memory of it. And Raimi loved it, because if he didn't, he wouldn't have used it. And everybody in the film was on board, for whatever that's worth. But the key casting of Green Goblin, because Raimi moved away from the idea of Dr. Octopus and Sandman. And they had their own, I don't remember the name of the screenwriter, I'm not sure. But they went with that Green Goblin was going to be the primary villain. And he may have gone in that direction because they had Nicolas Cage lined up to play Gabi. And Nick Cage was still young. He had won the Oscar for Leaving Las Vegas 4 or 5 years prior. He had made a lot of big hit movies, whether it was The Rock or Con Air. City of Angels had been a hit. Hell, even Family Man had been a hit. I feel like he was shooting, or he had just wrapped The Family Man, and he went to work on something else. But the idea was that Nicolas Cage was going to be a kind of a younger Green Goblin, or Norman Osborn. And Cage was signed. He was ready to go. But Hollywood being Hollywood, and this happens all the time, we know the story, and I've told the story, how James Gandolfini was signed, sealed, and delivered to be in Catch Me If You Can, but because of reshoots on Gangs of New York, DiCaprio and the shooting schedule had to be delayed, and Gandolfini had to drop out, could not do it, could not make that movie because of the shooting schedule fuck up, and it ended up being Tom Hanks, to the betterment of that film, I believe. In this instance, Nicolas Cage was working on a film by John Woo called Wind Talkers, and it was a massive, huge budget. The story wasn't good enough to justify the expenditure of time and money. And Woo was coming off, he had done Hard Target with Van Damme, which was, by Van Damme standards, very good. And he had done Face Off, so he was kind of high on the mountain, as they say. Nicolas Cage got stuck. Wind Talkers ran way over budget, way over schedule, like a crazy amount over schedule. Cage wasn't going to be able to make the start date. He wasn't even going to be close to making the start date for Spider-Man. He probably still got paid, but they had to go with someone else. So said, okay, we tried big star quirky. Let's go for another quirky. Let's get John Malkovich. Let's get John Malkovich. So, yeah, this was the Malkovich. He had done Rounders, which I absolutely love. Malkovich wasn't interested. There's one report that I read that said he was insulting by way of turning them down, but I think he just simply turned them down. If Malkovich had somebody on the phone, he may have sounded insulting, because that's just, he has his speech patterns are really his speech patterns. He's not pretending in a movie. So Malkovich turned it down. That's how Willem Dafoe got the role. And I think that Willem Dafoe was very inspired casting. And honestly, I think he should have been the first choice, given what I've just said. I don't know that the movie, it's not that the movie wouldn't work, but I don't think that Nicolas Cage at that point in his career, he was getting ready for movies like National Treasure. He did The Weatherman, Lord of War. That era, Nicolas Cage, I don't think that it works as well. Because Dafoe, yes, he has the crazy eyes. We know that. Everybody jokes about it. But he can also play hurt. He can play sad. He can play sympathetic. And we saw it all in Spider-Man No Way Home. So I like the casting of Dafoe. He doesn't feel like, oh my God, last resort, we're fucked if we don't get Dafoe. I certainly think that he was better and was a better idea than Malkovich. They should have gone to him first, but I understand the studio, they weren't sure, is this movie going to work? Tobey Maguire, he's not really big box office, even though he'd already been in a lot of box office hits and movies with huge acclaim, Oscars, etc., etc. But they went with Dafoe, and they went ahead and they shot the movie. And it wasn't that difficult of a shoot from what I can understand. Things went off. There were some special effects that many people took issue with. They felt that when Spider-Man was flying around the city, it looked too much like a cartoon. And not long after this, the Wachowskis took a lot of criticism because the actual wire work and fight choreography in Matrix Reloaded looks amazing in that film. But when that one sequence called the Burly Brawl where Neo fights hundreds of Agent Smiths, it looks like a video game. It's not that impressive. And so when Spider-Man is flying through the air in 2002 Spider-Man, it doesn't really look that great. When you're looking at Tobey Maguire, when you're looking at Willem Dafoe as the Goblin, I think the film I think it's great. But when it starts to turn into a video game, you kind of lose it a little bit. And that is a criticism which I would say is legitimate criticism. But I love the way the story builds. And if you want me to kind of continue the James Cameron aspect, the first act of this movie follows the scriptment very closely. Very, very closely. And then it goes off in completely different directions while still keeping to Uncle Ben dies. The wrestling match, by the way, Macho Man Randy Savage, may he rest in peace, is an absolute scream as the wrestler. You ain't going no place. Just like in real life, with that very peculiar way that he, not even delivering lines, just the way that he spoke, even in his later years. Oh yeah, step into a Slim Jim. But I remember, I saw the movie in theaters twice. I loved it first time through. And yeah, I was in agreement with the criticisms I've mentioned as far as it looks like a fucking video game at certain points. They should have just kind of dispensed with that. So that's what we don't know. The unknowns. How would James Cameron have handled that? What would he have done? Because when you think of James Cameron's films, you think of groundbreaking, cutting-edge CGI special effects. I feel like he would not have done that. My perception is that he would have figured out a way to make it more believable. I don't know what he would have done, 2002 era, but I believe he would have figured it out. Or no, it would have been 1996, 97 era. I just think that he would have figured it out. I don't know if he would have used some sort of strange stop motion, but anyway, we'll never know. We'll never know that. But even knowing the story, the origin story, and knowing that Spidey's not going to get bumped off by the Green Goblin, the hero is going to triumph at the end, the film still surprised me. All of the stuff with Flash Thompson, I wasn't expecting. I thought that was really well done. And the kind of friendship / romance between Peter and Mary Jane, I mean, the actors really sold it. And I know that at the time of filming, I believe it was at the time of filming, Tobey Maguire and Kirsten Dunst were, they were boyfriend and girlfriend in real life. And I like their chemistry. It's not like white hot chemistry. But then again, Tom Holland and Zendaya in those movies, they have really good chemistry. I feel like it improves as the series goes along. But I wouldn't say, oh, they must be hooking up. No, they're actors. The upside down kiss, I thought, was a little bit overplayed. It was a cool effect. He's going down the web, all that. That's fine. But that wasn't like, oh my God, what an incredible thing. But I like the way he masters his powers. I like the way he is incredibly strong, but he's nowhere near. He is nowhere near. He's not even in the same universe as presented in that movie as Tom Holland's impossibly freakish strength levels as a 15, 16-year-old kid in the MCU's iteration of Peter Parker / Spider-Man. I'm also a big fan of the sequel. In fact, I would argue that Spider-Man 2, if anything, is a better movie because they don't have to do the origin story. But see, I love the origin story, even though I knew it chapter and verse. And if somebody asked me the question, what comic books did I buy the most as a kid? Spider-Man. I don't want to say that I identified with him, but he was the most believable looking to me of the superheroes. And he was a kind of lunch pail guy. He didn't have, yes, he had incredible powers, but he still had to work really hard. Nothing came easy. Even catching crooks, as much as it was easier, he seemed to fight and struggle. And the fact that he was wearing a real costume, that's kind of a funny thing with Iron Man giving him these sort of weird suits where he doesn't have to clean them himself, like upgrading. Wow, this is great. But the fact that he would, in the comics, have these asides where he would say stuff like, man, what the hell's that smell? Almost like Will Smith in Independence Day screaming, what the hell's that smell, when he's on the Utah salt flats. That's what you're smelling, bro. But I remember reading a comic once, and Peter Parker is in costume, and he says, man, what the fuck? What the hell smells? What am I smelling here? And he realizes it's himself, because he's been running, jumping, fighting, sweating in the same fucking costume for the last 48 hours, and he hasn't washed it, and he hasn't washed himself. He stinks. The movie got that right. I thought that those little beats of, sometimes the costume rides up in the crotch, all gold, all great stuff. And when I was a little kid, and my mom would vouch for this if somehow she was forced to testify, I watched the old Ralph Bakshi inspired, the psychedelic, old school 1960s Spider-Man animated series, which you can find the episodes on YouTube. They are a trip. No pun intended. According to my parents, I don't remember this, because I watched it and the theme song was so catchy. Apparently, I used to go around the house randomly and I would just start singing the Spider-Man theme song. I won't subject you to it, but it's very catchy, and with the musical accompaniment, like if you were to go on YouTube and watch the intro to the animated series, very, very catchy. Spider-Man does whatever Spider can. It's so good. And I used to say that all the time. I remember reading an early review of Sam Raimi's 2002 Spider-Man. And in the review, they said, for old schoolers, the original Spider-Man animated series theme song is played during the final credits. And man, if that didn't make me happy, if that didn't make me want to get to the theater even quicker to see this movie, it did. So despite some reservations with turns of plot, and I feel like there must have been elements with Norman Osborn that were cut, because there's certain, like at one point he calls Aunt May, and I remember the first time through the movie, I was like, why is he calling her Aunt May? He barely knows her. That's very familiar. I feel like there was more stuff that they probably just cut for time, because they literally wanted to cut to the chase and get more to the action, because it is a movie that it takes its time in the first act. He gets bit, and then the powers and all of that. But I walked out of the theater invigorated, loved it, saw it again. And then Spider-Man 2, I also saw twice in theaters. Spider-Man 3, I didn't bother to go. Too many people told me it was terrible. I saw it when it came to, DVD. It was just okay. And both Andrew Garfield standalone films, I saw them in theaters. Not that good, just okay. Thought the first one was better than the second one. It just didn't work. But every film really that Tom Holland as Spider-Man has appeared in, but his standalone films, amazing. I thought Spider-Man No Way Home was as good a comic book movie, in its way as good as Avengers Infinity War, Avengers Endgame. To me, what will always be the gold standard for comic book movies, even though it's now a dated film, Superman 2. And not the Donner cut, the Superman 2 that we saw first. The Donner cut's okay, but it repeats the same trick as the 1978 Superman with the time switch. I absolutely love Spider-Man No Way Home. The way that Tobey and Andrew's characters were brought back in, the way that Tobey is now way more superpowered than he was in the non-MCU version of Peter Parker Spider-Man. Like, we're led to believe that he's just as powerful as Tom Holland. I don't think we get anything to say, oh, Tom is so much more, he's got 20 times the strength or the abilities or whatever. I remember, though, being upset in the 90s, but so often in Hollywood, when you get that kind of news that, oh, this is going to suck, it all worked out. Because, as I said, many of James Cameron's ideas ended up in the finished film. And James Cameron got to make Titanic, which he would not have gotten to make Titanic if he had committed 2 years of his life to Spider-Man. So you lose one and you gain another. And I believe that in this case, history shined on everybody, because it was part of James Cameron. It was going to be a big part of his legacy, that he was going to become an expert on submersibles, and the technology that he was working with presumably gave him ideas for Avatar. He did Ghosts of the Abyss, the documentary on Titanic. It put his career into a different direction, and I think that he's probably happy that he didn't end up getting saddled with, even if he could have made a great movie. I'm grateful it turned out the way it is. Despite that one day of thinking, why the fuck is he making a movie about Titanic? Come on. Tobey was a controversial choice. He never really looked the part physically, not big enough, but you saw what they did with Tom Holland. It's the same size. You don't have to be Diesel. If the movie had been made at a different time with different creative people, just like with Titanic, there were people who wanted to cast a different actor than DiCaprio. Could have gone with a young McConaughey. Some people were talking, well, Johnny Depp could do it. Sometimes the best decisions are the ones you don't make. In that case, James Cameron held out for DiCaprio. He ended up being exactly right. And in the case of Spider-Man, him ceding way. And then it took another 6 years for the movie to come out. It's not like he pivoted and, oh, now they're going to start making a movie. It took that long. If he had kept himself on ice much longer, he wouldn't have gotten to make Titanic. So everything just happened to work out. And, $825 million global box office for the 2002 Spider-Man. And I was a fan of Sam Raimi going back to the 80s, movies like Evil Dead, and then he did A Simple Plan. What a great movie. You want to talk about a sleeper, killer thriller, A Simple Plan. In the ballpark of Fargo, and Sam Raimi said that he actually consulted with the Coen brothers for ideas, because Fargo was a couple of years before A Simple Plan. But I think A Simple Plan was the best movie that Sam Raimi made before Spider-Man, for sure. I don't unabashedly love the Evil Dead movies. Even Army of Darkness, which a lot of people will put right at the top of the Sam Raimi, pantheon, is fucking incredible. But huge box office hit. A great filmmaker on the cutting edge of technology, taking some risks. He didn't take it easy. He took some chances. He went with some things that he knew were going to piss people off, and it was successful. So much money. Like, it's just a crazy box office gross. I mean, people were pretty sure it was going to be a hit, but you just don't know. As William Goldman famously said, nobody knows anything. We've certainly seen comic book movies over time that were expected to be huge, didn't quite get there. I mean, Black Adam, there were projections, people thought 500-600 million. It just didn't happen, And I thought Black Adam was terrific. I really liked it. I've seen it 3 times. You could have told me that it grossed 700-800 million. I would have said, yeah, fuck yeah. It's terrific. I thought that both Shazam movies were really good. Sometimes they just don't connect. But Spider-Man connected. Part of it maybe because it was in the city in 2002. There were some issues because they had shot a scene for the trailer, the Twin Towers. People didn't get pissed off, but it's like, all right, well, maybe we won't show this trailer anymore. This is really inappropriate and all of that kind of stuff. But The film is, I think all of the Spider-Man movies are on Disney Plus as we speak, freely available to one and all. And certainly if all you've seen, and I'm sure there are some people maybe in their teens and 20s that have only seen the Tom Holland, maybe Andrew Garfield, they know who Tobey Maguire is, but they haven't actually seen his 3. And you can skip Spider-Man 3. Just watch the first 2. They are great. They are as good, in my opinion, as certainly either of the first 2 Tom Holland movies. A little bit different approach. You know, there's no Iron Man in the Tobey Maguire Spideys, but really, really good movies. Very well done. And not just for the time. Even though some of the special effects are not going to work, they're going to seem even more cartoony and video gamey than they did back then. But can't take away from the performances and the level of commitment and what Tobey Maguire brought to the table, and all of the supporting characters and actors of Spider-Man, especially Willem Dafoe. Just an absolute home run hitter, a great actor, third choice, and acting like he's a star of the film and making it work. 22 years ago today, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man opens in theaters. I saw it, and then I saw it again a couple of days later, and I've probably seen it another 5 or 6 times since then. Absolutely love it. Well worth seeing for those of you who haven't, and worth seeing again if you haven't watched it in 15, 20 years, as many people probably haven't. There's so much other great material to get into. This has been episode 175 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you for taking me home, as they say, country road, on this Friday night in New York. That if you caught this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with episode 176 real soon. Till then, peace out.